Thank you, Professor Goldish, for joining the podcast. We wanted to discuss a very important topic, which we feel has been swept under the rug, the Shabbetai Ẓevi fiasco. A lot of people know it on a very shallow level, not really in depth. And we feel that it's important because Messianism is something that, keeps coming up every few hundred years in Judaism, and it's always a problem. And we wanted to kind of get your take on what happened. Obviously, we read Gershom Scholem's book, Shabbetai Ẓevi, The Mystical Messiah, but there are definitely differences of opinions in that. So maybe you can give us a brief overview of Jewish Messianism and then getting into the Shabbetai Ẓevi story.
Okay. First of all, I guarantee that after listening to me, people still won't know the story in depth. What you didn't mention about Gershom Scholem's book is that it's 1,000 pages long.
Yeah.
And it's only one piece of his scholarship about this movement. So whatever we can do in whatever 45 minutes or an hour is going to be rather limited, but hopefully it will be interesting and useful for people to hear about. So indeed, let me start talking a little bit about the idea of a Messiah. So in Tanakh, there are three kinds of people who are messiahs. And what it means to be a messiah, a Mashiach, is somebody who has been anointed, which is a practice which doesn't really exist anymore. There was a special oil. People used to put oil on themselves in the ancient world for various reasons. And there was a special oil called the Shemen HaMishcha, which was used to sort of announce that somebody was going to have a special status. So three kinds of people used to be anointed, used to have this oil placed on them by the leaders of the people. That was kings, prophets, and priests, Kohanim, right? So over the course of the period of the Tanakh, that was kind of the use. During the period of the Babylonian exile, according to the historians, something like 586 to 520 or 510 BCE, and then in the Second Temple period, the period of the Bayit Sheni, the idea, the terminology and the idea that people had when they used the term Mashiach really kind of changed. And without going into it too much, by the late Second Temple period, the period of about 2,000 years ago, up until the destruction of the Bayit Sheni, of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era, the idea that people had in mind when they used the term a Mashiach or a Mashuach was not any Kohen, it wasn't any king or prophet, but was a very specific type of person. It was this idea developed again over lots of time, that when you use that term, what you're talking about is a human agent who is going to be sent by God, or is going to be helping God to bring redemption, redemption to the world, redemption to the Jewish people. That was kind of the concept by that period, and that is the concept that people have in mind, of course, today when they talk about a Mashiach. And in the late Second Temple period, the late Bayit Sheni period, there were a whole bunch of different people who sort of presented themselves or were understood by their contemporaries to be messiahs, Mashiachim. And what it meant at that time was something rather specific. The Romans had taken over control of the land of Israel and of the government of the Jewish Commonwealth. And people thought that God would send somebody the way he had sent the Maccabees to throw out the Hellenists, the Syrian Hellenists, in the 2nd century BCE, right? The story of Hanukkah, right? This little group of Kohanim, as it happened to be, who threw out this mighty Greek army. So I think that people expected that to happen with the Romans too. People expected a similar miracle. So they were waiting to see who the person would be that God would send. So the expectation was that this person would be a military leader, the way Matityahu HaKohen had been in the time of the Hanukkah story, and would lead an army that would throw out the Romans. So there were various figures, and they're discussed in the Talmud. They're discussed probably more accurately and in greater detail by Josephus Flavius, who lived in that period, the historian. And there are a bunch of different figures. There's well, whoever they are, most of them are pretty much long forgotten. There's one who apparently some people still talk about occasionally, a guy named Jesus of Nazareth. He was a Jewish Messiah of that period. Very strange, probably a very minor movement at the time, but you might have noticed that that one's still around. That was probably, I think it's safe to say, the biggest Jewish Messianic movement ever, Christianity. But it stopped being a Jewish Messianic movement and stopped being, strictly speaking, a Messianic movement. You can imagine easily how this concept of a Messiah, of a Mashiach, could spill over into divinity. In other words, it's easy to understand how a human being working at God's right hand, helping to bring redemption to the Jewish people and to the world, could start to be considered a divine figure. And especially in the Greek context, and there was a lot of Greek influence in Eretz Israel at this time. The Greeks had a lot of ideas about humans who are also gods, and gods who are humans, and all that kind of thing. So you end up with Jesus of Nazareth, who is not, who starts out as a Jewish Messiah and ends up as a universal divine / Messiah figure. And that's a long, complicated history, which is not my personal field, but it's worth talking about because it gives you a sense of how much power this idea could have for people, and also an issue which comes up over and over again in Jewish history, the divinization of the Messiah turning into something more than a human figure, something more divine. So this was the situation in the ancient Jewish world. And as you correctly said, messiahs show up in Jewish history with great regularity over the entire period of Jewish history. People are usually embarrassed by these movements afterwards when they appear to fail to manifest. And so we probably don't know about the majority of them. The ones that we know about are because some piece of writing about them happened to survive. And of course, what that means is that the closer you get to our period, the more messiahs we know about. But it probably doesn't mean that there were fewer of them in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. It just means we don't have records of them. The ones we do have records of are quite interesting. And it's funny that you said they show up every few hundred years, because they show up way more often than that. Think about the 19th and 20th centuries. It's seldom that there's not somebody, and this is a modern world, right? This is a rather cynical and skeptical world in which we live, and yet messiahs who attract a following continue to show up with with significant regularity. I don't think I have to mention who some of them are. For your listeners who are interested, a book that kind of covers what we know about this whole history is by my late close friend Harris Lenowitz, called The Jewish Messiah, is published by Oxford University Press. Harris was a linguist, and it's kind of a, I don't know, it's not the kind of book that everybody in the field or anybody else in the field would have written, but it covers what we know about these messiahs from all these different periods. And I won't try and talk about who they were and what they did, but I'll just mention two kind of different trends or general ways that these messiahs worked. Some of them were like the main group of messianic figures in the Second Temple period, in that they were essentially military leaders, somebody like Bar Kokhba, who was in the 2nd century of the Common Era, somebody who comes forward and essentially presents himself as, I am going to lead the Jews back to the land of Israel. I'm going to lead in a sort of a physical and spiritual sense. Other people follow a more kind of spiritual messianic message. And the truth is, once again, that Jesus of Nazareth is kind of the model in some ways for this. The idea that Messianism isn't necessarily a military kind of movement, right? The expectation of the Messiah, the job of the Messiah isn't necessarily to go fight off the enemies of the Jewish people, but rather to bring them to a kind of spiritual salvation. And that's kind of a break with what the idea of the Messiah had been earlier. But as I say, Jesus of Nazareth introduces that idea. Maybe there were people before him that we don't know much about. Maybe the idea was going in that direction already, but we definitely have figures like that in Jewish history.
Even the concept of a second coming seems to be like introduced by Christianity, because we see like the group you don't want to mention in Crown Heights or other places, they have this idea of the second coming, which is very new to Judaism.
So it's possible that even that idea had roots from Judaism already. There were also ideas that were coming not only from the Greeks, but also from the Persians, from the Egyptians. And so even the idea of a phoenix, right? Something that keeps coming back. It's constantly destroyed and then reborn from its own ashes. In some ways, that's almost the concept that some rabbis have had about the Mashiach, right? The idea that every generation has a potential Messiah, potential Mashiach, and it's all a question of whether the generation deserves it, or whether people have been behaving properly, or whatever it is, that every generation, right, has its Messiah. That person so far has not manifested himself, but it's just a matter of time. There's a Chazal, there's a Gemara that says that one of the rabbis ran into, I guess, Eliyahu Hanavi, and he says, when's the Mashiach coming? And he says, well, he's already here. He says, yeah, where is he? He says he's at the gates of Rome. If you go and look at the lepers who are gathered at the gates of Rome, you'll see that all the lepers who are there, they change their bandages. They all take their bandages off at once and rewrap them. But you'll see there's one guy who takes his bandages off one at a time and puts them back on one at a time. That's the Mashiach, because he's got to be ready in case he's called to manifest himself as the Mashiach. He doesn't want to be stuck with all his bandages off, right? He's got to be ready to go. Whatever the deeper meanings are of that Gemara, it tells you that there is this almost phoenix-like concept of the Mashiach among the rabbis, that he's always there, he's always ready to go. It's really a question of whether we, right, whether the Jewish people have deserved to have Mashiach come and manifest himself. Among scholars of the Messiah, right, academic scholars of Jewish Messianism. There's a certain feeling that some people have that the one thing that could absolutely destroy Judaism, right? We've survived everything, the Nazis, the Romans, the Greeks, everybody, right? We've survived everything. The one thing that could actually destroy the Jewish people would be if the Mashiach actually came. We would have no idea how to deal with that, but that's probably just cynical academics, whatever that's worth.
There's also there's a Gemara that says if Mashiach is from the dead, it would be Daniel, which a lot of people use as the argument. Say, oh, you see, Mashiach, right? So if Mashiach could come from the dead, then the Gemara already answers it. It's Daniel. It's not whoever you think it is.
Well, there's actually a Gemara in Sanhedrin that says, "Ein Mashiach liYisrael far achlu b'yamei."
Hillel says that. Yeah, Hillel says that.
Yeah, Hillel, right? Not Hillel Hazaken, but Rebbe Hillel, right? Who says that? So there are all kinds of things in the Chazal which are confusing and which we don't know what to do with. But that shows you how much of a Jewish concept the Messiah is. There's no agreement, right? Opinions and the Chazal do a great job, right? The Talmud, the rabbis of the Talmud, they bring down every opinion. They don't shrink from telling you, Rabbi Hillel had this unbelievable opinion, Ein Mashiach Yisrael, and so on.
But you're saying originally the consensus or the established view, let's say with the Rambam later on brings down, is that he's a military figure, and then it kind of became this kind of spiritual leader over time?
I would say that there is a significant conflict, although they would never admit it. There was a significant conflict or difference of opinion between the Rambam's idea of what the Mashiach was going to be, which is, again, a concept that the Rambam takes directly from the Chazal. He takes it from a Gemara, but he essentially paskins, I guess you would say. He makes a decision that this is the rabbinic opinion that he is going to follow, that the Mashiach, right, what is it? He says, Ein bein yemei HaMashiach liyemenu anu ela shibud malchuyos bilvad, right? That the only difference of the days of the Messiah and our days is going to be a political difference, that we're going to be under our own political rule. But I would say that the Kabbalists differ very significantly from that view. And my teacher, Moshe Idel, in his book, Messianic Mystics, and in other places, especially studying Avraham Abulafia, has shown that there is a wide variation in what Jews have expected about the Mashiach. And even within the Rambam, right, we're talking about Rambam Maimonides, 1138 to 1204, living in Egypt for much of his life. His view is certainly as close to canonical as it gets after that. And yet, even within the Rambam's opinion, there is quite a wide variation possible. And it's very interesting that Nathan of Gaza, who was a leading figure in the movement of Shabbetai Ẓevi, managed to use the Rambam's own words in a way that the Rambam could not possibly have meant them, right, to support the Messianic standing of Shabbetai Ẓevi. So there's some, right.
That tends to happen with the Rambam, though. The Rambam's words tends to get, Yeah,
and the most aggravating part is that he was such a clear speaker and writer that it's like, how are you twisting his words? It's like,
yes,
he actually has in his Igeret Atchia, in the beginning, in his letter of Tchiat HaMeitim, the letter that he sent out defending his position on the resurrection of the dead, he actually, in the very beginning of that letter, he says that there's a common thing that keeps happening, is that someone tries to say something so clearly, yet somehow that very thing that you meant specifically for it to be as clear as possible gets twisted in every which way.
That's right.
He knew that this was a phenomenon, and he probably knew that his words will somehow also get twisted throughout time.
Avraham Abulafia, who you mentioned, wasn't there some type of messianic connection there as well? Or?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
So Avraham Abulafia was a messianic figure, but I'll tell you this, he was also the first person to write a complete commentary on the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim.
Right.
So he was at the same time a Maimonidean, a follower of the Rambam, and saw himself completely as a supporter of the Rambam. And he was himself a Messianic figure and a mystical one. He was a leading, although largely forgotten before Edel, at least, or before Sholem, but he was a leading Kabbalist of the day, much despised by a lot of people, but had a huge influence, in particular, a huge influence much later on the Hasidic movement and so on. So he's a perfect example of somebody who's able to combine a conviction that he is a follower of the Rambam and a messianic identity and a mystical messianic philosophy. So it's exactly as you say, right? The Rambam prophesied a postmodernism, right? 800 years ago. He knew it was coming.
He knew. His example that he used was like it says in the Torah, Hashem Echad, God is one. Yet somehow, the Torah is telling you God is one, as clear as possible. Yet somehow we figured out a way to make God as 3
or 10.
Yes,
10, or whatever, however you want to interpret that.
That's right.
You know what I mean? It's unfortunate, but it happened.
So you mentioned
this is the world that God created. We communicate with each other through words and through written and oral speech, and yet there's no way to make somebody else understand everything the way you understand it.
It makes Judaism a lot of fun, though.